Welcome to the Content Champion podcast. We provide the training and tools to help you become a content marketing champion in your online business. Introducing your host, the content champion himself, Loz James.
Hi guys, welcome to the Content Champion podcast. Thanks for listening. On the show this time, I'm delighted to be speaking with Christian Toto, award-winning journalist, member of the Broadcast Film Critics Association, and founder of discerning film news and reviews website Hollywood in Toto. With a manifesto to provide film reviews with a purpose and interviews that avoid fluff, Hollywood in Toto looks at Tinseltown and its movies from a conservative perspective, encouraging friendly, impassioned debates on the cultural matters of the day. From a content marketing perspective, running a news-based website presents its own unique challenges, so I wanted to know how Christian manages his site and deals with some of the issues that arise from creating and promoting news-focused content. Let's dive in. Thanks for coming on, Christian.
Thank you.
Before we dig down into content marketing for news-orientated sites, could you tell us your backstory, please, and the story behind Hollywood in Toto?
Sure. I am a recovering art major. That's what I studied for a very long time in college. Switched to journalism at the end of my career and was a pretty successful run at two different newspapers. And then I kind of segued into online outlets as, of course, the journalism changed and shifted away under my feet. And I was able to kind of go with the flow and be successful, but I also found myself kind of conflicted with some of the editorial visions of the places I was working for. So in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I'd really love to do what I want to do. I want to write the topics I want to cover, and I want to maybe pass on things that are a little bit more tabloidy. It just wasn't what I was interested in. And I thought, I've been in the industry for about 15 years. I've got lots of contacts. I've got experience. I'm kind of an established film critic. Let me try this on my own. I've been sort of so curious about online businesses, and it seems like the potential is there. So that's when I decided to create Hollywood in Toto, and I hired a designer and did a lot of the basic work myself. With the art background, that certainly helped a little bit. And that's where I am today. So basically, it's an online site. I'm trying to create news that other people aren't doing, kind of cover topics from a right-of-center perspective, which, again, is not exactly what you see in most entertainment sites. So I'm covering Hollywood and news and movies and television, podcasts, things like that, and doing it from a conservative point of view. And that's my mission. There's not a lot of other sites that do exactly what I do, and hopefully I can do it better than the rest and make it original and fun.
And I know your audience base is growing because of that sort of unique take on everything, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a real hunger for it, especially in an election season, which we have here in the States. That certainly makes my life a little bit easier and a little bit more fun sometimes. So, yeah, it's very interesting to see all these cultural issues pop up. And what's intriguing from my niche is that it's not just the Donald Trump stories. It's Ghostbusters, the remake, is all of a sudden a culture war issue with feminism and gender issues and potential sexism. So, that's the kind of stuff I often cover. And I feel like every day there's a new topic I could jump into.
Have you seen that film, by the way? Is it out yet over there?
No, it's coming next month. So I'm very curious about it. I hope it's good, but the early trailers have not been positive, but we'll see how things go.
We'll look at some content marketing action steps to help our listeners in a moment. But first, could you tell me what unique content marketing challenges are faced by people who start news-focused sites?
Well, one of the problems I've been having so far is that there aren't a lot of products I can review. I know a lot of different niches you can, if you're in the yoga niche, you can review different DVDs or products or water bottles or something. A lot of different niches have a lot of different products you can kind of compare and contrast, and that's a great value to the reader. I don't necessarily have that. A lot of the stuff that I cover, I can't compare 16 different, high definition televisions because I can't get them into my house. So a lot of it is sort of not really applicable to my particular beat. Also, I find that sponsored posts are a little more challenging. I had a daddy blog up until fairly recently, and I was inundated with sponsored post possibilities. That's where companies reach out to you. They want you to review their product, and you're often compensated for it. So that's sort of a nice little revenue stream. And I've struggled within the news niche to kind of recreate that. It just doesn't fit as well as with some other sites. So those are two things off the bat. And also, you're just dealing with the big boys. If there's a new Star Wars movie's out coming soon and the news breaks this week, the New York Times is covering it, Variety, all the big outlets are going to jump on it. So where do I fit in? And that's where you have to get creative. You have to kind of think about the different angles, the different approaches that the other sites aren't tackling. I mean, they're going to cover the basics, what's the new movie, who's the director, what's it about, when is it coming out, but maybe I can go in a different path, maybe compare it to previous Star Wars films, maybe compare and contrast the Star Trek and Star Wars franchises, maybe look into the director who's been assigned to direct the new film. What does he or she have to offer? What did their past work say about the future project? So you really have to be inventive.
Okay, so there are some inherent, we won't call them problems, we'll call them challenges with operating a news-based site. So let's look at some specifics. I know your journalism experience can help with this. How can we make, effective use of on-page content? You hinted at it there, but, including elements like headlines and writing stories using a sort of inverted pyramid journalistic formula. What tips can you share with us here, Christian?
Sure. I was thinking about my local paper, the Denver Post, and it still operates as if it's 1978. The headlines are stodgy. The angles are the same kind of angles they've been covering for years. It just feels old and retro and not in a good way. So, you don't want to abandon journalism principles. You don't want to kind of throw them aside and just kind of go whatever you want to do. You've got to kind of retain the basics. You got to be sort of reliable. You've got to have a lead that really grabs you and grabs the reader. You've got to have headlines that are magnetic and that really make sure that you don't want to kind of click away. So I think it's kind of a combination of using 21st century new media with sort of the basics of journalism. So that's what I'm trying to do. That, you got to kind of set things up right in the front. Don't get too bogged down in details in the beginning of your story, because then the reader's going to click away. So kind of hook them at first, tell them what you're going to have to offer, and then slowly get into it. So those are some of the things I do. And also, you have to kind of think about your stories like almost like a TV segment producer. You can't just have text. You've got to have infographics, maybe have a fun GIF in there, maybe do some pull-out quotes, have some embedded videos. Think of it as sort of a rich experience. And that's something that journalism has had to kind of segue into, where if you read an old newspaper, it's just the text and maybe a subhead. Today, that doesn't really work anymore. So you really need to have a more complex experience. Give them a reason to not just check out your text, but kind of experience the whole story and think about ways you can kind of make it more intriguing.
Now, I'm going to throw a curveball at you here, because I used to be a journalist. I started out as a BBC radio journalist, and that's how I trained initially. Has it been very difficult for journalists to transition into the new sort of content marketing world? Are they in conflict really, or, are these just skills that journalists are going to have to get up to speed with?
Through the years, I've been aghast at talking to journalists and talking to editors who have been resistant to the changes that are happening within the industry. I spoke to people who say, well, in our office, the online people were on one side of the room and the print people on the other. I mean, it just seemed ludicrous. So I think for every journalist, it's different. I've also spoken to a major movie reporter who right away, as soon as the industry started to shift, she wanted to create a blog. Her bosses kicked and screamed that she forced her way into it, made the blog, and it kind of basically forged a reputation in new media. So I think for every person it's been different. I think the industry overall has struggled in many ways, both, I guess, monetizing what it means to be a journalist and also transitioning, bringing a video recorder to an event and kind of taking video and uploading it to YouTube, or maybe even sort of taking audio snippets and putting them into your stories. So everyone's been different. I feel like I've been sort of in between, where I've been able to kind of go with the flow. But at the same time, it's hard for me to write those sort of clickbaity headlines, frankly. It's difficult. It doesn't come easily or naturally to me. But I know that's some of the compromises you have to make to be in journalism in 2016.
I know many former journalists who are now trying to adapt print journalists, and doing exactly what you've been talking about. It is very difficult because it can be a different mindset, and that feeds into sort of journalistic models and paywalls and ways that you can monetize sites as well, which I know is something that we're going to talk about in terms of, how news sites can monetize and make a go of that model. But last year it was a great pleasure to speak with David Meerman Scott on the show. We talked about the art of newsjacking and being agile and reacting quickly to news stories. So how does this approach impact, our online content and SEO considerations with a blog like yours?
Well, I think newsjacking is really important. What I like to do with my site, and what I recommend, is that you're going to have two types of content. You have content you've been planning maybe for days, if not weeks ahead of time, that you've got kind of scheduled into your calendar. And once that rolls out, then maybe you have a little extra time in the day to jump on a breaking news story, look at Twitter, see what's trending, look at Google Trends and see what's going on in the world right now. And maybe you can kind of fire off a short, quick story that kind of jumps on those different trends. That way your particular news site will feel fresh and alive. Now, it's great to have sort of the more established evergreen content, but sort of that mix of the two, I think, can be helpful. And it doesn't have to be a huge 2,000-piece epic. It could be something short and sweet. But like I said, if you can find a fresh perspective on a breaking news story, that could be really valuable. It can kind of go viral. It can kind of catch fire on Twitter. And you never know where it's going to come. It's as much as you predict and plan, some things take you by surprise. So just know that even your great plans, even when you think you've really kind of nailed a zeitgeist, maybe you missed it for some reason. So it's a humbling process. But I think the mix of evergreen stuff and newer Newsjack related material, I think that could be helpful.
And with the agile news stories, of course, you get the sort of the double hit of the initial share-worthy social media type content, through the clickable headline maybe. And then if you've optimized it properly and there are some initial newsworthy SEO considerations, some value there, you can get some, traffic from the long tail over time. And I know the cycle with the Newsjack sort of agile article is much shorter, but you can sort of get some benefit from both social and organic, can't you?
You can. And, one of the things that's interesting, and it's hard to do sometimes you can't even do it, if you're doing that sort of quick hit story that's sort of jumping on a trending topic, if there's any way to make it a little evergreen, to kind of write it in a fashion that doesn't speak to right this very moment, try that approach. See if you can do that, or maybe even go back the next day and maybe tweak the story just gently. If you have to put an editor's note and just say, hey, the story has been updated, that's perfectly fine. But sometimes you can tackle a breaking story that may have legs on the internet. And that way, you kind of have the best of both worlds. You kind of catch that initial wave, and maybe in a year or so, there's something still relevant about that story. Again, it isn't always possible. Some things are just super trendy and you can't really help it. But there are times, just maybe think about the big picture as you're writing your content.
Okay, we talked about evergreen content and, we've discussed this before this call as well. And I know it's something that you want to focus on. A lot of blogs out there, a lot of content marketing experts focus on this evergreen style content because it's perhaps easier to produce. And then by extension, the news output that you're looking at, is that harder to get right? Is that why people don't focus on news-orientated sites so much within the content marketing space?
Well, I can't speak for other people. It is complicated. It's also extremely hard to predict. Some of my most popular articles have been stories that I never would have expected. I had a contributor write a story about sexy horror movies, and it wasn't titillating. It was just kind of a fun piece and written from a female perspective. That is my number one post that just gets constant traffic. And I guess in part because people are searching for those similar keywords. It was a very long post, so it's got a good level of text, which Google likes. And maybe that's just a topic that is endearing to people. I've also found that I've written about celebrity chefs who have TV shows, and those tend to be among my more popular posts as well. That's just anecdotally saying it's really hard to say. I mean, you can do everything right. You can do all the keyword research you want. You can sort of research the topics. You can make a story that's 2,000 plus words. It's embedded with videos. It's content rich. You don't know for sure what's going to happen. So I think sort of the uncertainty of it can maybe be intimidating to some people, and I certainly understand that.
Looking at the example you gave at the top of the show about the new Ghostbusters film, the all-female cast, to tie that in, to an agile story with an evergreen content approach, you could, and you wanted to sort of hoover up all the keywords for the long tail search over time with SEO and get that shareable value, you could do a new version of the film versus the old version of the film and write a really long piece, as you say, 2,000-3,000 words, and contrast the two. That might be sort of one way of getting around it, perhaps.
Yeah, and one thing I failed to mention before is whenever you do have a post that is particularly attractive to readers for any reason, think about ways you can kind of spin that off. I did a story years ago about I think the movie was Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead. It was about a man who had real health issues, and he changed his diet dramatically. He embraced a juicing diet-based formula. He bounced back. He became much more healthy. But that particular story took off, so I reached out to the guy and did an interview with him, hoping to kind of piggyback, because obviously there was a lot of momentum behind that subject. So that's part of it as well, sort of realizing when you've got something that's working, how to kind of leverage that as well. And of course, we can go kind of deeper into discussion, see how you can kind of repurpose that content in different formats. But that's another way to kind of spread your brand and spread your name out there.
So evergreen is definitely possible within the news-orientated content marketing sector.
Yeah, I mean, I've written stories about a particular chef that came out for a particular season, like, oh, this is the new season 12 of so-and-so show. And those interviews, people still seek them out. So even though it was technically timed to something that was time sensitive, it didn't matter to people checking it out on Google. So yeah, I think Evergreen works. And I just pick topics that are fun and with the Batman, the TV show, the silly kind of goofy TV show from the 60s had its anniversary a few months back. So I did a lot of research on like 30 crazy facts about Batman. That was tied to the anniversary, but that could be read at any given time, and people are still seeking out that particular post as well. So it can be time sensitive, but at the same time, it also can be timeless.
Okay, right. I'm going to dig down now into your own site. We're talking about HollywoodInToto.com. You said earlier on you're sort of avoiding that tabloid style of writing, and from reading the blog, you're kind of making a stand for intelligently written film news reviews and interviews, as you've said. But do we need those clicks? Do we need that clickbait type headline? Do we need to, I hate to say it, almost kind of dumb down the style of writing to make them more clickbait friendly? Or is that a misnomer?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think over the last few months I've kind of come to what I hope is a reasonable kind of solution. Basically, what you're saying is absolutely right. You can write sort of more traditional headlines, more sober headlines, but there's a very good chance that people simply are not going to click on them because they're not grabbing them right by the scruff of the neck. Now, you can say, well, I don't want to do the clickbaity stuff. What I've kind of done is a compromise. I am leaning more towards clickbait headlines, but not the sort of the aggressive, this is the greatest movie of all time, but just a little bit more fun, a little bit more curious, a little bit more provocative. But I think if the story backs up the headline and the story is a high enough quality, I think the reader will forgive that. It'll draw them in and they'll say, hey, that was a pretty good story. The fact that the headline seemed a little bit like BuzzFeed or some other sites, I'm okay with that. So that's my hope, that if I have a headline that sort of falls within that sort of parameter, if the story itself has the goods, if it really kind of performs, if it leaves the reader with a good feeling, if it kind of gives good information, I think that's a healthy compromise. So that's where I am now. I do think you really have to make sure those headlines sing. You have to make sure that they really grab people. And if you don't, I don't care how good the content is. We're living in a world where people just go scanning the web and they find what they want. And if it doesn't get them right away, they're gone. And you have to act accordingly.
You're listening to the Content Champion podcast, showcasing the training and tools you need to become a content marketing champion in your online business.
We're back with Christian Toto. It's difficult, this. A bugbear of mine since the Google algorithm changes some years ago has been this sort of content arms race where you have to have full-length 2,000, 3,000 word articles, even though they could be quite low-grade list posts with, multimedia in, with an image or a video for each point. You could get these posts, if the keyword research is in order, outranking an exquisitely written 600-word crafted piece of journalism about the same topic that will never see the light of day, even if it's promoted. And that is problematic. We're talking to a small business audience here. It's problematic in terms of how, sites and businesses within sort of perhaps a news or agile sector can ally those two problems, or the dichotomy between what Google picks up on as being good content. I suppose we're talking about, how Google judges high quality content, to what we know as journalists perhaps should be viewed as good quality content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that's where another compromise comes in. Maybe you do a story or two each week that kind of caters to the Google SEO crowd, where it is a list post. Maybe it's not very compelling. Maybe it is kind of silly and frothy. But you know what? If you mix in that story with a bunch of other articles that are actually meatier and have much more to say, I don't think the reader is going to kind of flee your site because you kind of put out a listicle. I think the listicle will draw a certain crowd. I think your other stories will kind of attract more readers. And at the end of the day, if enough people read your good stuff, they'll share it too. So even if it doesn't have that Google SEO juice, it may have the, hey, this was a great story, I'm going to go share it on Facebook. And when other people read it, they'll have the same reaction. So, there's different ways to get an audience and get traffic. To me, you kind of go for everything. You go for the SEO, you go for the shareable stuff, you go for the stuff that's just high quality content. If you mix it all in, you can go to sleep at night feeling a little bit easier about things and not being too worried that you've sold out.
Sure. And I guess as well, if we're looking at a content marketing sales funnel. We're looking at, top, middle and bottom of funnel. Some of that more frothy SEO clickbait stuff you're talking about would be enough to draw in people, maybe in a sort of titillating type sense, and then they get to your site, see some of the more meaty content on there, and then perhaps sign up, and then you can draw them into other parts of your output that you really want to sort of draw their attention to going forward.
Yeah, one of the things I do, which is pretty common across the web, is in every story I write, I'll put little related links. So I kind of pick up the theme that I'm working on and maybe draw them in deeper into the site. And maybe if it is a listicle that's kind of silly and sort of cottony, maybe there's a link to a deeper story within there that maybe people will check out. Think about how we all go online and read content. We're not always digging into the latest political news or the latest sort of arrests or anything that's serious. We want a kind of a potpourri of stuff. We want silly stuff. We want serious material. We want the sports scores. So there's nothing wrong with having a site that kind of caters to those different needs and wants, because it all depends on what you want to read at any given time.
Great. So it's all about the mix and the blend of content that we're publishing. Something you touched on there, and we talked about a bit there, was email lists. And what's your take on sort of email marketing and, lead magnets and that type of thing within this sector? Because I guess that comes with its challenges as well.
It does. This is an area that I'm currently failing at, but I'm in the process of kind of correcting the problem. From everything I've read and everything I've studied on the subject, email, your leads are huge. You've got to get a bigger subscription base, and you've got to kind of leverage that when you need to leverage it, when you have to have an ebook to sell. I don't have a large subscriber set at this point, but I'm working on sort of an ebook style giveaway. I'm working on adding an opt-in form to my site that's kind of basically a pop-up box that will work within your site. It's sort of tailored to get people as they're leaving, different ways to kind of draw people in. So it's an area where I'm just struggling right now, but I kind of know where I need to go, and it's really crucial, because that email list is really can be your bread and butter. That's where, if you're going to do a change within your site, you can let people know. If you want to reach out to people and say, hey, what do you think of Hollywood and Toto? Do you want to see me cover different topics? Well, give me some feedback. That's your direct conduit to your readers. So it is critical. I am working on it, but I understand where I need to go. And it's, for everyone else listening, definitely pursue that heavily. There's lots of ways, especially, it's not a lot of high cost efforts. There's lots of programs under $100 where you can kind of get yourself up to speed. And also think about your existing content. You can just basically repackage material that you think has been a hit with readers and just kind of put it into a very compact form. Take your best listicles, take your stories on a popular theme, put them all together, re-edit them to make them kind of more streamlined, and then make that your giveaway. And then people say, hey, I can sign up to Hollywood and Toto because I'm going to get this free PDF on 21 great date movies. And that way they get something, and then I get something because I've got a new subscriber.
You mentioned some of the solutions there. Just got to do a shout out for two that I use, Aweber and Active Campaign, for different types of sites. But for my personal site, Content Champion, Active Campaign is fantastic with all the bells and whistles and things you can do with that in terms of segmenting your email lists. Just before we move on to the next question, because this does fascinate me in terms of email, I'm thinking that maybe, your specific take, your USP, may be enough to entice people onto your email list. If you want film reviews with a specific, stance, sign up for our email list, the types of reviews you won't get elsewhere. Do you know what I mean? There is an element with a news site where the type of reporting itself can help to build a tribe.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, frankly, I leverage that specifically when I'm marketing my materials outside, when I'm on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and other sites. I kind of know where my audience lives, and I basically reach out to them in those places and try to spread the word about my particular story. So another thing I've done is I basically kind of created a network of, I guess you could say, fellow co-conspirators, people who sort of have a similar ideology to me, who support the work that I do, that I support the work they do. And I often reach out to them and ask them for, hey, can you give this story a quick share? I really worked hard on it. I think it's going to be good for our particular audience. And they're happy to do so. And then I do the same for them. So, that's not what a traditional journalist does, I don't think. But that's, I think, what you need to do right now to kind of make sure that more people check out your work.
And compared to evergreen content that we've talked about previously, is it harder to promote and, say, build links to shorter, agile, newsworthy pieces than it is to evergreen content?
I think it is. It depends on how well you hit a particular target. there have been stories I've written that I thought I really nailed. I released them quickly. I thought they were right on target as far as the trending theme. And then it didn't really catch fire, frankly. And other times I'll do the same and it will kind of get some attention and get the links that I'm kind of seeking out. But that part of that is that, my site is still fairly new and I need to kind of more aggressively reach out to people on social media and elsewhere. So a lot of it is sort of the heavy lifting you have to do. And there's, people keep saying, writing is only part of the story. You really have to market what you write. The publish and pray technique just doesn't work. And it's so true because there are been times I've written really good stories that I'm very proud of and they don't get the traction. Yet the cat video that was released, a week ago is still bouncing around the web. So it's a very humbling experience for sure. But the tools are out there. And as an online entrepreneur, it's amazing how powerful and potent the tools are at our disposal at a very reasonable cost.
So your schedule when you've published a post would look something like, share it on social media, go to your influencer group, and then perhaps, go to some niche specific sites to get word out about the new post?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I do variations of that whenever I can. And frankly, I should do it more. I'm a journalist and I'm a writer first, so that's always my first instinct. So it's been hard to kind of train myself to be more of a marketer. And one of the reasons why I listen to your podcast is I need the education, frankly. So that's just been what I've needed to do to be successful and to stay alive in this area. And it's important enough to me, and I love it enough where I'm willing to do that. But it's a transition. It's a new skill set, and I feel for fellow journalists who are doing what I'm doing because it's not easy. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of learning.
Well, that's the reason I love doing this because obviously I get to meet intelligent people like you with great sites, and we share a lot of interest in the journalism backgrounds. But also, I learn a ton each show, and every time I talk to new people. So that's why I keep doing these podcasts. One thing I'm going to throw at you before we go on and look at where we can find you online and discover all your work and everything else like that. The content publishing model itself, are we looking as former journalists at really having to go towards a BuzzFeed style, high velocity, high frequency publishing schedule? Or can we be a little bit more nuanced than that? Do you see what I'm getting at? For journalists listening to this, and I know there are some people in my audience who've come from that background, do we really have to go towards the BuzzFeed high octane model, or can we do it in a more nuanced way than that going forward?
The two newspapers that I worked in Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. They were the smaller of the two major newspapers in each city, which basically meant we had to work harder. We had to be more inventive. We had to be kind of take guerrilla tactics as far as getting the word out. And I kind of think that's a similar place you're in as an online news creator, because like I said, you've got the New York Times and all the major, the Guardian, all the major newspapers. I don't think you can directly compete with them. You can't crank out as much copy as BuzzFeed cranks out on a given day. And I think if you do so, if you kind of try to keep up with them, I think then things start to kind of fall apart. You make mistakes. You get, errors creep into your stories. It's maybe not as well thought out as before. So, I do try to tackle some topics when they come right out of the gate. But I think you have to be more realistic and more patient. I think you have to kind of say, hey, listen, Google likes longer stories. Work toward that. Google likes more evergreen stories that are richer. Think about all the things you can embed to make it a richer experience. I used to write 4 to 6 stories a day on my site, but I've slowed down because I want my stories to be better and richer and more powerful and different. So when I write a movie review, for example, it's not just a movie review. I'll embed an interview with the actor involved. I'll do the trailer. I'll put little fast facts about the film. And then I'll also say, hey, if you like this movie, check out so-and-so. So I'm trying to make it a more comprehensive experience than other sites, and hopefully that'll draw a crowd. I mean, I just think you have to do that because you can't compete with sites that have much, much bigger staffs and more resources. You just can't do it.
Okay, so we know we have to promote, but very simply, we are saying that quality is everything, ultimately.
I think so. I mean, that's the bottom line for me. I mean, I hope it is. If at the end of the day, then the cat videos reign supreme, then I think a lot of us are out of work. But I still have faith that people really respond to well-written stories, thoughtful pieces, and stories that don't antagonize as much as some other sites. There's always people who are going to be sort of fiery and have lots of kind of crazy rhetoric, and they'll get attention. But you do need talent. You do need sort of discipline to be in it for the long haul. And that's my plan. And hopefully that's where I'll be in 5, 10, 20 years.
Brilliant. Well, that's music to my ears. So look, just before the PS question, could you remind us where we can find you online, please, so we can discover all your latest work?
Sure. My main website is HollywoodInToto.com. You can find me on Twitter at HollywoodInToto. And I also contribute to a couple other sites, including PJmedia.com and Acculturated.com.
Wait for it, listeners. Here comes the PS question.
Could you please share, Christian, one more advanced content marketing tactic that we can use right after the show?
Great. It's funny. This is not technically my forte, but I wanted to kind of give what I do with particular stories, and hopefully it'll help out, because I know it's the kind of thing that I often make a mistake in, and hopefully other people can kind of maybe learn from my mistakes. Think about your next tweet. When you think about a tweet, you're sending out information, and if it's going to be a promotional tweet, if you really want to spread the news about your particular story that you've worked really hard on, don't just tweet it out. Make sure it's got a photograph. Tweets with visuals are much more likely to be shared and clicked on. Make sure that it's the right ratio. I believe the number is 1280 to 720. And that's something you can fix with PicMonkey.com, which is a resource. Did you include 1 to 2 important hashtags that maybe will help spread the word about that particular tweet? Did you mention people who have been sharing stories like your stories, or maybe themes that are mentioned within the particular story itself? So just make sure you don't kind of click away that tweet. Everything is really valuable. And listen, you can go online and go on Twitter and kind of retweet stuff and make pithy little comments. But when you're sharing your posts, the ones that you've worked so hard on, please just make sure that each and every tweet is maximized to the most potential, because that could be critical. That little 5 minutes of effort, little extra intensity could make a huge difference.
Well, that's great advice. And it's been a great conversation, fascinating for our listeners to get the lowdown really for the first time on the podcast of looking at content marketing from a news site perspective. So, Christian, I'd just like to thank you for your time today and wish you all the best with everything in future.
Oh, thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Content Champion podcast, available at contentchampion.com and on iTunes. Until next time, thanks for listening.